I think I understood what truly owning a business meant, right? So then you start to make decisions like it is your business, right? Until then, I always said that you need to operate like it is your business, but I didn't quite know what that meant.
Hello, and welcome to the Growth Minded CFO. I'm Lauren, and this is Alex. And I'm a fractional CFO, and Alex is a fintech CEO. On this show, we speak to finance leaders about what it means to be a growth-minded CFO. Finance is not a backroom function. It's so much more than that. And we've searched out the best in the business to learn more about what the true role of the CFO is today. Joining us today is Rita Kale. Rita is a CFO of a New York-based biotech company. She brings 20 years experience in finance on a very international stage. Focused on life science sector, she was a regional and country CFO at Roche for multiple global markets. Truly impressive CFO and leader. Rita, welcome to the Growth Minded CFO.
Thanks, Lauren.
So Rita, walk us a little bit through your journey of how you became a CFO.
There's a slightly unusual answer to this. I got the opportunity to work in a variety of different roles and then joined Roche Pharmaceuticals, which was based out of Sydney in the finance and controlling area. So we used to support out of Sydney, which was the hub for the Asia Pacific region. We used to support 9 markets in Asia Pacific. So it gave me a wonderful opportunity to travel the Asia Pacific region, get to know the countries better. But more than just the systems and the finance part of it, I understood how business was done. So it was really good to see how each of the countries there had different challenges, different solutions for similar challenges, and how they all went about things in their own, unique ways. It was a fantastic experience. And then after that, I went to South Africa, did a project which was leading the SAP finance team for an SAP implementation in South Africa. And did that wonderful experience again, got to really learn about the intricacies of how business was done in South Africa, because you can't implement anything without understanding the flow.
Sure.
And as it turned out, when I got back to Australia, I got offered a role by the same audit team that had audited us in South Africa. So I got the chance to come to the US and join the audit function. Did that for a few years and traveled the world with the audit team. Again, it's a helicopter view of how things are done, but it is the best university in terms of teaching you how each of the countries operate. It gets you deep into operations, but also gives you a bird's eye view, right? So you have a way of learning from one country, applying it to another, or understanding something from one country and really understanding the same thing in a different way in another country. Fantastic education. Then I got my first opportunity to be the CFO of Roche Diagnostics India. So it was a little bit of a different route that I took, but my first CFO opportunity sent me back to India, which is where I was born, to lead the finance operations there.
That's such an interesting way to get into the role of it being in finance. You started out with this very international lens. Oftentimes as CFOs, we start from sort of one territory and grow out. And you sort of did the opposite, where you're looking at a global level and then going local. What was that transition like, changing focus in that way?
It's a good point that you make there, because I think it was my experience in the global markets or my understanding of how Roche operated on a global front that helped me get the job in India. So although the job in India was a hyperlocal job, if you will, it is in a global company. So it's always good to understand those dynamics and figure out how you cross that bridge. In terms of transition, you go from a high-level perspective across different markets to a hyper-local perspective in a domestic market.
Yeah.
However, the training as an auditor and as a systems consultant as well was really, really useful,
Mm.
especially as I first landed that role. Because as an auditor, you don't have unlimited time to understand what it is that you're about to be auditing, right? So you have a limited amount of time. You try and become an expert in a short period of time so you can really deep dive into the operations. In a similar way, when you go into a new country, you have 30 to 60 days to truly understand what the market's all about, what the macroeconomic environment is, how do you operate in that country, what the challenges are, building the relationships with the key decision makers, truly understanding, your stakeholders well.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to do in a short amount of time, and I think the audit training was very, very useful to me in that role. So yeah, and just to point on that, Roche doesn't well, the CFO role in Roche is a variety of different things beyond finance. So when I landed in India, I was also leading the legal and compliance function. I was a compliance officer for the company. I led the IT group at the time.
Oh,
I led
wow.
supply chain, logistics. So there was a bunch of different things, and I don't think any other job could have prepared me for that role better than the audit function.
Yeah.
So very exciting role and lots to do in that market. Hyper growth phase in the country. So year over year growth at the time was about 70%.
Wow.
But also the attrition of the people there was very high.
Okay.
So challenges were different. The opportunities were great, and really bringing it all together was a wonderful opportunity.
Wow.
And something super interesting you said earlier was around just mentioning this thing around having the same problem but having very different solutions to this, right? And I think this is something we see in larger groups and larger teams in general.
Right.
Would you say that your experience from other countries, even if it's a hyper local Indian position, right? Would you say that your experience from other countries helped you in your role? Like you could bring some of the knowledge or experience to your this position?
That's a great point. So yes and no.
Okay.
And I'll say that the caveat is you need to know that what you have learned from other countries is an interesting data point, but you cannot cut and paste.
Yes.
There's no lift and shift in solutioning. So when
Right.
you try and do that, you could make errors which are pretty consequential. So understanding how other countries have dealt with the problem is a fantastic point to know and to bring to the table when you are discussing solutions for similar problems in the other country. But assuming that the same solution would work exactly in the same way is, I think, a grave mistake. So really acknowledging that yourself also takes time. I can't say I was, I knew that then. So when you come in, you need to really stop and take a step back and understand the entirety of the context before you apply solutions that you learned somewhere else.
And how did you do that? Because I think it's so India was probably your home country in some ways, but it's still you're just landing in a new country. Let's say that it's a new country and you know some of the things that from your functional job and stuff, but not necessarily how the local rules and stuff will apply. So do you have a kind of a phase where you just observe and stuff, or do you have any tips for people that would be in the situation?
I have refined exactly that point over time because I do have the tendency to jump in and say, okay, I know how to solve this. What are we waiting for?
Right.
But it truly is something that you need to fully understand. And, if things are urgent and the house is on fire, of course, you're not going to sit there and think about, what is your 2-month, 3-month plan. But if you come in and if you find that there is a problem to be solved, really understanding the context is super important. So the first 30 days, the first 60 days in a role is where you literally map out all the stakeholders, all the points of view that you need to seek to get to a decision, and try and stay away from major decision making in the first 30 to 60 days. Unless it's critical, of course, but we're not talking about that here. So really try and stay away from enforcing some really consequential decisions.
Even if you'd like to.
You will like to.
You'll be tempted.
You'll be very tempted. But it's an important one to just restrain yourself and make sure that you understand whether it's been tried before, if it hasn't worked, why it hasn't worked, and understanding the nuances is really, really important when you go into a new country or a new role.
That's such an important point of having that restraint. And it sounds too like those conversations with those stakeholders, as you'd mentioned before, data points. It's
Yes.
just one data point. Like you're gathering more data points from those stakeholders.
Right.
When you're having those conversations, what do those look like? How are you kind of getting the information that you need so that after that 30 days you feel prepared?
So one thing that is evident in the CFO role, and I'm speaking of the role specifically, but this probably applies to every other C-suite role out there as well. You have a variety of stakeholders, internal and external. And almost no one stakeholder is more important than the other because each of them brings something different to the conversation. So you have the CEO, who's a really important stakeholder. You have the entire executive team. You have the external stakeholders. In a startup, they'll be different than a large company, but you do have the external stakeholders, the external auditors, the investors, the bankers, and the people that you deal with. Your partners and your customers are your other external stakeholder, very important to understand. And then you have your teams. So you need to understand the perspectives of each of those. And they would be slightly different, right?
Sure.
Depending on what it is that you're solving for. But just getting that 360 view of every problem is super important. The challenge is you can't do that for everything all the time in the first 60 to 90 days, right? So
Sure.
prioritizing is the key aspect of this role. What is it that you truly need to get right? And what is the most important and critical thing that you need to solve for? And then really putting back all the others and making adequate time for them later on. But prioritizing the big rocks is the most critical thing.
That prioritization. And it sounds too like you got a lot of those instincts for prioritization, as you mentioned, from that auditing background.
Yes.
That needing to go in there and get that thing done and
Absolutely.
understand.
Reduce the noise, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to come back on one point that I find super interesting was the point around SAP implementations where you started. I love that point because, like we work with a lot of CFOs. It's part of my job. And I think one thing that is a constant thing across the board is just that those CFOs have just like something that they hate all in common is just like implementing their ERP, right? It's always this kind of project that always gets delayed. And, and when it happens, it's always sold as it's only going to take 2 months. And then like 12 months later, they're still like in there. And it's always more complex than you think. And we're always trying to find like first the best solutions out there, but also like the best partners to actually implement them and just make those recommendations. But I was kind of curious to hear about like your experiences. This is starting from this area of like implementing SAP. How did that help you in your job? And also maybe embracing this as a kind of a positive thing rather than we have to do it and this is going to be a nightmare type of thing.
Yeah. So I can't say I'm that different from the other CFOs, despite the fact that I started with that as a function. But I do have a point of view which may be a little bit different. It is, I don't like doing strength work when I'm training, right? I don't like it. I know it's good for me, but I don't like it. But if I spend time doing strength work, I know that my running could be better. So I would use that analogy for CFOs as well. It is work that is super important to put in the planning phase. If the CFOs who are implementing ERPs, and I'm talking about, I believe you talking about CFOs who are implementing ERPs, right? Yes. So if they can get in deep enough to sign off on the design of what it is that they will get, it may not be something that they like to do, but I believe that's something that they must do because that'll save them so much time, after the fact in fixing things that become a problem. So for most people who don't like getting into the design phase of an ERP system are most likely people who don't like fixing things later on either. So it's a choice. It's a choice that you make. If you can spend the time to sign off on the design, to make sure the controls are right, to make sure the configuration is set up to get you what you want it to get you, then you don't spend so much time and money fixing the system later on, right? So it's just a choice that you make.
It's an upfront investment in some ways. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah.
It is.
I think it's also something that what you say is just really interesting in terms of like making sure that like you plan and you allocate the resources for that, just not seeing that as the project that you don't want to do, so that you just like putting this on the side in some ways, and so it's like setting you up for failure as well when that happens. And I think that's something that is super interesting and that we've seen where it goes either really well or really, really bad if you haven't allocated
and these
the
are
resources.
expensive systems. So
Absolutely.
like with any other investment, if you want to make sure that it works for you, then you need to put in the time and effort. Yeah.
What I'm hearing too, when talking about something like an SAP implementation, is we talk so much in Growth Minded CFO about being that strategic CFO, being kind of at that high level and thinking about the growth of the company. Something like an implementation like this, it kind of pulls you back into that sort of execution, less strategic. But it speaks to the importance of when to switch context, when to switch gears, because actually it is important now to be executional. We need to get this right. We need to design this properly, get in the weeds, and then flipping back to your strategic hat as well.
Absolutely. And it's a closed loop, right? I don't think that you can design a very effective SAP system if you don't know the business. Because at the end of the day, so finance gets to see everything that's happening in the company.
That's right.
Everything.
Yeah.
So if you can figure out how to make the system work so that you actually optimize each of those processes, you need to know the business to be able to do that.
Yeah.
If you don't know the process flow, if you don't know how information flows, how your customers want things done, how your peers want things done, it's going to be very hard to have an implemented system that'll give you what you need. Totally. So it's a loop.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. I love that idea of the closed loop. And I think we talked a lot with Lauren on like, how the CFO is much more than like this kind of like back office function and sits in the middle of the teams. And I think the point that you're bringing here that I find really interesting is the fact that like you need to understand the business so that you can help the business as well. Like having this loop around the things. And it's also another thing that you touched upon that I think is super interesting there is also the fact that like you can't just apply and again, taking out of the box what you've seen working before in another company or in another country and just say, we're just going to do the exact same. You can't do this. You have to understand first and then deploy the right solution. So I think it's super relevant. Yeah.
I do have a perspective that I'd like to share about the back office function of the CFO and how it's changing. To me, and maybe this is how I've seen this done, almost every effective CFO I know and have known has never been a back office CFO. I've never seen an effective, successful back office CFO. I've seen effective, successful, well-rounded CFOs who know the finance space as well as they know the business. But I don't think I've known very effective CFOs who haven't known the business and have only known the finance space. So to me, I understand the dialogue around it now. I've read a lot about how CFOs are now moving from being more just execution focused or finance focused to thought partners to the CEO and more strategic and horse whisperers. To me, that's always been true. Yeah. So maybe people have a leaning towards one or the other, but you just have to build that muscle. Whichever you don't have it, you have to be a well-rounded CFO to be effective in the work that you do. So I don't see the change as much as I've heard it because that's always been true.
Yeah. Actually, it's I echo sort of this idea of when I've seen a back office CFO, it is most times where it feels like there's a little dysfunction going on. Like this is not optimized. And I feel like I often will see it at companies. I focus mostly on smaller businesses and startups, and I notice it at companies where there's a lot of transactions, there's a lot of financial operations to be done, and the team is under-resourced. And so I think the CFO gets pulled into that process. Right. Or they started with kind of an accounting background or a controller background, and that's what they know. And they sort of need to make that transition into more strategic thinking.
Right.
But I think you're right where the strategic CFOs have always been really the ones that are really functioning well in the role.
Right.
And that hopefully moving into the future, more folks can get there
Yes.
more quickly and can realize that's a transition that needs to be made.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's a timing thing, right?
Yeah.
Depending on where you are in the life cycle of the company, certain things are more important than others,
Mhm.
right? So at the beginning and the startup stage, you need to figure out how you're going to survive in the next, 6, 12, 18 months. Funding becomes super important. It is all of this takes priority over everything else that you're doing. But as you mature as a company and as a finance professional, you need to figure out a way where you can get away from doing just that to truly adding value to the business. Because again, it's a closed loop problem, right?
Right.
If you so you optimize the financials, you absolutely have to. We used to call it financial peace in Roche, which means the books are in order, you're audit ready, everything's working like a well-oiled engine. You're not worried about what the auditors are going to say, or there's a tax problem, or the revenue guys are going to come knocking on your door because you've done something which is a little bit dodgy. So none of that. That is the financial piece.
I love that term.
Everything else, then me too. I've kept it with me. Everything else then is built on top of that.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is absolutely right. If as a CFO, you need to get that baseline right. Nothing else is priority until that is done. But then if we're talking about effective CFOs, more mature companies, how do you become somebody who truly matters to the company and can add value to the company? You'll need to transition from making sure that the financial piece is always kept, but then it just needs to function on its own. And then you can start really contributing to the business.
And it's super interesting because it also comes back to your point around prioritization and like investments.
Right.
Because it's like, I think one of the things that we've seen, and we can tell quickly when you look at the systems of like a company when we first meet with them. And sometimes you see that like it's a kind of I think it always come back to this idea of like a lot of spreadsheets like all over the place, and it's just like, and sometimes you see those finance teams that are totally overwhelmed because they spend so much time on, low level things that is about like getting to this financial piece that you mentioned earlier, but it takes way more time and it's way less controlled in some ways. And at some point you just say, hey, we need to stop. We need to make that investment so that we can have more time to do like more.
Yeah, and the investment can be in other technology. It doesn't have to be an ERP system.
Absolutely.
Because many startups will struggle with, having, and it probably don't need an ERP. It's a Mercedes solution for, a company that needs a bicycle. So the question is, which bicycle do you get? And that needs to be something that you need to think through. Is it going to make you more effective? Is it going to make you more efficient? Is it something you can afford? And where is it going to add value? But there are a plethora of systems out there based on the problem that you're trying to solve, which can make you more effective and efficient.
It makes me want to talk to you more about, you've recently transitioned. You were with Roche doing CFO level work in lots of global territories. You've recently transitioned to a startup.
Correct.
I'm very curious to hear more about that transition. First, what inspired you to make that change?
So this is something that I've wanted to do for a while. I have had the opportunity and the privilege to work in a variety of different roles across the globe, seen different perspectives from different vantage points. It's been an incredible experience. Then I did work with Foundation Medicine, which is also a Roche-owned company, but it was operating autonomously. We had our own board. We used to work fairly independent of Roche. It was not a startup. I would call it an adolescent, right? So it was like 13 years in its journey, and we didn't have an ERP. The systems were different from Roche. And there I led all the finance functions, and I was also the head of corporate management, which meant I led business development, portfolio planning, procurement, and revenue and access. So a variety of different functions. That gave me a taste for what it's like to be a fairly independent, contributor in, not independent contributor in the way that people see that, but more as a company, right? So we were on our own, but we had an investor, if you will, who had deep pockets. The other role that really primed me for this opportunity was when I was doing the regional CFO role in Asia Pacific. It was a variety of different markets between really mature, like Australia, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and emerging markets, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. And the perspectives, again, were so different, so diverse. There, the role was more about it's almost like you're managing a portfolio of companies and you're figuring out where can you get the biggest bang for the buck, right? So where do you put your resources to get the best out of the region? So it was literally like you're making those bets. And then I said, okay, I must do a startup experience as well. And this is not my first startup. I had my own startup. Did that for a few years. And that was the best thing I've ever done. So it was a development experience like none that I've had before, because I went into that experience with a finance background. And I emerged from that 3 years later as a person who had built their own website, done strategic deals with Google and Microsoft, actually went and done events, like anything and everything. You wear so many hats.
Interesting.
And I loved the fact that, I wanted to come back to the startup environment because I liked that. You wear multiple hats. You don't have a job description. You do whatever needs to be done to move the business forward.
Yeah.
And I wanted that, the speed of action, the impact.
That's amazing, because you also then had the experience of being a founder. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, that experience happened, was that between two different moments where you were at Roche? Did you come from that experience and then go back to being a CFO? How did the experience of being a founder change the way that you were a finance leader at a bigger company?
It changed it a lot, for the better.
Okay.
I think I understood what truly owning a business meant, right? So then you start to make decisions like it is your business.
Yeah.
Until then, I always said that you need to operate like it is your business, but I didn't quite know what that meant. So I went out and really had my own business. So when I went back into the corporate world, I knew what it actually meant to have those decisions. I understood that cash is king for a business, and how important it is to truly optimize resources and make sure that everything that you invest, you get the return for. So that was good.
That's so funny because I'm a startup founder, and and sometimes people say, oh, we live in we're a little startup inside the big company and stuff, and or you meet with venture capitalists and they say, oh, we're just a team of 4, so we are a little startup. And I often say, like you haven't really been a founder until the point in time where you've been worried about, like, is there going to be cash on the bank accounts to just
right.
pay?
What is your own money?
Yes. When it's like about the to do the payroll at the end of the month, and I think that's something that you've experienced, and is probably really like changing the way you look at like you work, like wherever you're going next, and that's super interesting. And I think it's amazing that you could apply these learnings. One of my questions that I would have, because this is something we get often asked, and it's also a question for us when we bring people from those large companies. What was the biggest challenge you had when joining, like a smaller company? Because you bring a lot, of course, and you have a lot of experience, but there's also some challenges that you have. What was the biggest one for you?
I think I missed my network. So given how long I'd been with Roche, I didn't even realize it until after I'd left. I knew people everywhere in the company. So if I had a problem I was struggling with, which was new to me, I knew exactly how to find somebody who could help me with the answer, right? So that was one. Here you have to start from scratch. So yes, there are other people that you could share with, but they're not working in the same company. So how much you share is also limited, right?
Yeah.
So it's a little bit. You need to build that whole network again. And it is an important skill to have to create that from scratch. And the other thing is, there were many things in Roche that you took for granted. Even though I was in the country CFO positions, I didn't really have to worry about hedging or foreign exchange or cost of manufacture of certain new products, or finding new products, like developing new products. Those were not my worries. My worries were commercializing what I had, right? Making sure that the commercial success was what we optimized for. But there was a lot of worries that I did not have. In a startup, you own all the worries, right? So
Tell me
and I
about
love that.
it.
I actually loved it in foundation medicine because it was a microcosm of Roche. We had R&D finance, we had manufacturing finance, we had commercial finance, and we had the entire gamut. In a startup, you may not have all of it, but you will have much of it. So, really finding out how you own every problem and resolve every problem is a challenge, but also very exciting.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Rita. That was super interesting. We're going to take a little break and we'll be back shortly.
Welcome back to the Growth Minded CFO show. I'm here with Rita and Alex, and we're going to pivot topics a little bit and start talking about work-life balance. The role of a CFO can be really challenging. There's a lot that goes into creating that financial piece that we've already discussed, my new favorite term, plus pivoting and being that strategic thinker. So I'm curious, Rita, what have you developed as your ways of sort of building work-life balance, building that sort of personal piece as well?
So this realization dawned a little late for me, and I wish I'd paid more attention to it earlier on in my career. But once it did dawn, I realized how important it was for me to
Yeah.
do something personal for myself, which was just for myself. And it was my own time. And I got that when I started running. So it is super important for me, regardless of how busy the day. I need to make some time in the morning to get my run in. So it is not just a way for me to relax, because running's not really relaxing, whatever they tell you. But it is my way of finding time for myself, something I enjoy. And actually, I think, again, it loops back into what makes me more productive at work. I feel like I'm a much more productive CFO because I find time to run in the mornings. So there's a lot of benefit to finding your own thing that you can claim, that you enjoy, and that you can actually put in as part of your routine. And I think the benefits far outweigh the time spent on them.
What was the process like of discovering running as your thing? Did you try a couple different things? Was it challenging to set the boundary?
I think
What
you
was
know the
that
story
like?
behind this, Lauren. That's why you're asking me, but okay, I will tell you. It was a challenge. I was turning 40 and I wanted to do something a little bit different for my 40th. I didn't want to have this big party that everybody wants to have at the time. I thought I'll do something a little different. And for some reason, my husband and I were in Central Park at the time and we saw the end of the New York Marathon. And I saw that people of all shapes and sizes were coming back in, and it really looked like they were achieving something. I didn't know a thing about running until then. I'd never run a minute in my life, nothing at all. And I was so inspired by seeing people come back. So I said to my husband, I think that's what I'm going to do for my 40th. I'm going to run a marathon.
Wow.
And my wonderful husband, God bless him, could not help himself. He laughed. So he just let out this little laugh. He just could not help himself. And I'm like, okay, that is it.
Now you have to do it.
Now I have to do it and I will do it. So I trained for the rest of the year and ran the next marathon.
That is incredible.
And then I caught the bug and I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah.
And he still hasn't stopped laughing, but that's another story.
That's so nice. Ed, what he's saying is super interesting in terms of work-life balance, because that's something that we see a lot with CFOs and in general with people that are in these kind of like higher positions, is that you get pulled in so many directions. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges we see with CFOs especially is the fact that like they're being pulled into very low level like kind of things that we discussed earlier, but also being asked to do like sometimes of like strategic advice. And you can't really do this if you don't have the peace of mind of like, all right, this is stable. Right. I can spend time on this. So would you say that like having this right work-life balance also helps you like kind of like prioritizing and spending more time on this?
Yeah, I think the work-life balance, at least the way I'm looking at it, is doing something that allows you space and time beyond just working on something. Because it's almost like you're pulling yourself out of the work that you're doing and giving yourself the opportunity to think about it more clearly. So, in that way, absolutely, it helps to prioritize. I think a lot of the time that I spend running, especially before I have a really big meeting coming up, I actually don't listen to podcasts, which I normally do when I run. So I don't listen to anything. I don't listen to music. I don't listen to podcasts. I just think when I'm running. And by the end of that run, my mind is a lot better sorted out than when it was when I went. So now I allow for that time. I don't even do much prep. I know that I'm going to do it when I run. So it's really helpful from that perspective. So yeah.
That's amazing. I run quite a lot as well, and I'm
Do you find the same
yes,
benefits from
100%.
it? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you just like, people think that like you thinking when you're working and you're also thinking when you're running, but it's totally different.
It's a
right?
different quality of thinking as well.
Yeah, because you're just only like, it's basically like doing, a lot of people say it's doing nothing, but you're not doing nothing. You're really thinking, and you're getting like, I think your phone, your emails, your Slack notifications, there's always something coming in, and then you're running for like an hour.
That's right. It's
and
a focused. Totally.
And especially if you run regularly, that's what I found as well. Because like, I'm getting onto these routines as well, where you're just always going to the same spot. And people are like, why do you always go to the same? Actually, because I'm happy to just, spend that time to think, not necessarily like discovering something new and stuff.
That's exactly right. And you don't have to worry about directions. You know exactly what you're going in for. So yes.
We got the bug.
I'm not a runner. I should be. But I'm a potter. I do pottery, and I feel like I get some of the same thing from it.
Yeah.
And I know when I first starting businesses, I'd had a hard time trying to feel productive, not working.
Yeah.
And I had that same kind of epiphany, that discovery, where actually to find answers, to problem solve, which the higher up in the company you get, the more that's your role.
Right.
You're less
Right,
there
exactly.
to execute. You're there to solve problems. You're there to think. And you need downtime to think. You need that environment to let your brain come up with the answers. And I find sometimes if, I take a day and I go to the studio, I've actually been so much more productive because these 5 things I was working through, boop, they're all done. Like they all just worked in my brain. I didn't even think about it. And I can be way better when I come back. So yeah, same experience.
And everyone has to find their own way of doing it. You found pottery, we found running. My husband has his own startup, and he finds what really helps him a lot is meditating every day. So he finds time to do that no matter what. And that's really helpful for him. So everyone has to find their own way of whatever works for them.
Yeah.
It's also super interesting coming back to the point of like the international culture, and our company is split between France and the US mostly, right? And as you can probably tell or know, maybe there's a big difference in terms of taking time off between France and the US, right?
Yes.
And it's super interesting for me as a CEO to just try to also tell people here in the US, for example, to take some time off, because I'm often sharing that, like, for me, like the best decision that I've made for the company have been made when I was off. I was just like suddenly had this moment where, all right, we didn't think about this, but we have to do this. And it's suddenly coming up to your mind. And it's happening because you're just somewhere else, or because you just like, and it's not only about like the energy and being like, just refreshed in some way. It's also like taking a different perspective. And it's about like finding the right thing. But sometimes I see people that are so tired and they keep on like, kind of pushing. And it's just like, hey, take a day off, come back, and it's going to get better.
Yeah.
It's not always
so true. It's so necessary, I think, to be a effective problem solver, to have some space.
Absolutely.
Rita, thank you so much for being a guest today on the show. It was really, really interesting. And I think we learned a lot from your experience, from a lot of different background, countries, and also a different type of companies. I think that was something that was super, super interesting. This kind of move from a really large organization to much smaller startups, and how like all of them completed each other. I think it was really, really interesting, and I think it will inspire like a lot of other finance professionals. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was really, really great.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, it's been a real pleasure. If you like that episode and like that show, please subscribe on the platforms that you've seen. And if you want as well, you could share this episode with some of your friends or people that you know. this would be super helpful for us in continuing the podcast and the show with Lauren. We look forward to the next episode with more guests. And thank you for watching this episode of The Growth Minded CFO.